Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to the 2020 Ahead program webinar. We still have, looks like a lot of people are still logging in, so we are going to get started in a couple of minutes. Thank you for your patience. Welcome to the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco's 2020 Ahead program webinar. It looks like attendance is stabilizing, so we're going to get started. This presentation is intended for our member financial institutions and community organizations participating in the Ahead program this year. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started with the presentation. Everybody is in listen only mode right now, so you're all muted. If you have any questions, there is a question box within the GoToWebinar app that you have on your screen. Please ask questions there, and we will take 2 different breaks during the session to answer questions. But keep in mind when you're asking those questions, try to keep them high level that could potentially benefit all 200 plus attendees that are listening in right now. If you have project specific or very detailed questions, I will include the contact information at the end of this webinar, and you can contact the bank or myself, Chris Ferreira, and we will be happy to answer those questions. Slides were sent out to all registrants as of about 12:30 today, so if you registered late, you might not have got those. I will follow up with slides, and they're also in the handouts section of the webinar is also the slide presentation. And the last note is that we are also holding a second webinar on May 19th at 10 a.m. So if you have any colleagues that couldn't attend today, that is another good opportunity. So with that, let's get into the presentation. As I said, I am Chris Ferreira. I'm the head program manager here at the bank. And this is the agenda and the roadmap for what we're going to discuss today. The majority of the presentation today will be about the application process, as you can see from the agenda. But do note we have a couple of other pieces that if a member and a sponsor do win an award, there is a disbursement piece and a compliance piece. We're not going to go into heavy detail on that section, but I do think it's good information to share with members and sponsors just so that they know what they're getting into if they do end up winning an Ahead award. As I said, we'll have 2 different stopping points to answer questions. So just send those questions through the question box and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. So before we get into the program itself, we always like to give a little bit of history around the Federal Home Loan Bank and the Federal Home Loan Bank system. So the system itself was chartered by Congress in 1932 as a funding resource for home mortgage lenders. And lending institutions use the Federal Home Loan Banks to finance housing and economic development in their local communities. There are currently 11 Federal Home Loan Banks around the country, and clearly we're the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco. We are regulated by the Federal Housing Finance Agency, or FHFA. They are the same regulatory agency that regulates and is the conservator of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The Federal Home Loan Bank itself, as with all the other Federal Home Loan Banks, we are a privately owned cooperative that is owned by member financial institutions. In our case, those that are headquartered in Arizona, California, and Nevada. Members can include a wide variety of financial institutions, including commercial banks, saving institutions, CDFIs, credit unions, and some insurance companies. So while we are a private corporation, we are not a federal agency. We do, since we were created by Congress, we do have a public service mission, and that's to create a range of products and services that do benefit our members and the communities that they serve. So this is a graphic representation of the different community programs and activities that we're involved in. So today, we are here, of course, for the AHEAD Economic Development Grant Program. We also do have another larger economic development program called the Quality Jobs Fund that really works on creating quality jobs or providing job training and upskilling. We also, the big programs that we offer on the grant side also are the AHP Competitive and the AHP Set Aside. Very briefly, the AHP Competitive are grants for multifamily, typically multifamily housing, affordable housing development, and the AHP Set Aside program is through WISH and our IDEA programs, and those are down payment and closing cost assistance for low-income first-time home buyers. We also do have a couple of lending products that we call SICA. There's one called CIP and one that's ACE, and these are both discounted lending products that our members can access if they are making small business loans or if they are financing affordable housing. We have, this slide has not been updated based on the pandemic, but we do have some disaster relief resources. In the past, that has been mostly around wildfires, and we've now expanded a lot of those programs around the pandemic. And then finally, we provide webinars and workshops just like we're doing today around program education. We do provide technical assistance to our members and to their nonprofit partners. And we do our best, of course it's tough in this environment, we do our best to do outreach, attend conferences, sit on panels, go to project grand openings, and try and just share information and be a convener of information and resources within Arizona, California, and Nevada. So the AHEAD program itself, which is why everybody is here. So AHEAD stands for Access to Housing and Economic Assistance for Development. These are funding for targeted economic development projects that benefit lower income communities. The program was started in 2004 and has been funded annually at the discretion of the board. A couple of the grant programs we briefly discussed before, AHP Competitive and AHP Set Aside, those are both federally mandated by FHFA. AHEAD is not mandated. Instead, we fund it every year at the discretion of the board. So funding levels may change on a year-to-year basis, but the board has generously approved funding since 2004, and we've awarded over $14.5 million to 517 projects since inception. And then last year, we funded a little over $780,000 in a pilot program for 5 disaster recovery and resiliency projects all in Northern California. This year, we're very proud to announce that we originally had allocated $1.5 million to the AHEAD program, but the board has generously approved an additional $1 million specifically for pandemic relief initiatives. We'll talk a little bit more about this later in the presentation, but we are very excited that the bank is providing other resources in a very tough economic environment that we're in right now. Grants can be up to $50,000 per project. In 2019, the average grant size was about $27,000. This has been consistent with past years. $25,000 to $30,000 tends to be about the average grant size. Usually is between $20,000 and that maximum of $50,000. Generally speaking, we do not fund projects with less than $20,000 unless they specifically have requested that smaller dollar amount. The program is competitive, so I do want to let interested parties know, and we imagine that the competition will be even fiercer this year based on scarcity of resources and the extreme need for funding in this environment. But to give you an idea, last year we had 193 eligible applications requesting over $8 million, and we ended up funding $1.5 million in projects to 54 different projects. So it's about a quarter of projects have been successful. This year, it's a bit of an unknown how strong the market will be, but like I said, we anticipate it will be a lot of demand for the program this year. The project sponsor in AHEAD grants, for AHEAD grants, can be a nonprofit organization, a local government agency, or tribal association. And at this point, I just want to make clear on the terminology that we at the bank use and that you'll see throughout this presentation and all our materials. When we talk about a project, we are talking about the entity being a nonprofit or a tribal association that's going to be the ultimate beneficiary of the AHEAD grant. When we're talking about a member, we're talking about the financial institution that is a member of the Federal Home Loan Bank, and they are the organization that will support the application, submit all documentation, but the money, the funds, if an award wins a product, will go through our members and it will be passed through them to the project sponsor. So keep those terms in mind when we're going through this presentation. For AHEAD, projects can only be located in Arizona, California, or Nevada. And the grant funds must be used within 18 months of the award date. And we'll go over a timeline shortly. So eligible use of funds. Before getting into eligible use of funds, we just want to be clear around the one major restriction for the use of AHEAD funds. We had mentioned earlier, we have a couple of affordable housing programs, one for multifamily, it could be single family, but single family or multifamily housing development or rehab, and also the down payment assistance for low-income first-time home buyers. Basically, AHEAD can't be used for any potential line item that could be funded in one of those programs. So that's the big eligibility issue. So the example that I like to give is that AHEAD could not be used to actually be part of building any affordable housing project because AHP, the competitive program, could be used for that. However, if there's a job training or workforce program at an affordable housing project, AHEAD could potentially fund that program. So there's an example of where AHEAD could and could not be used. So this is not to say it can't be used at an affordable housing project. It just can't be used for any of the construction or any of the development costs that in theory could be used by the competitive program. As far as uses, it is a flexible program. We expect it to be used for a wide variety of different projects. This is a list I'm not going to go through. It's not exhaustive, nor is it exclusive. It's just a representative example of eligible project uses. The big piece is that it is an economic development program. So generally speaking, we expect it to be some type of targeted economic development project. There's an asterisk there this year around the pandemic, which I'll talk about in 1 minute. But generally speaking, these are project-based economic development grant programs. So the pandemic piece for this year, as I said, the board has approved an additional $1 million in funding for 2020. As with the regular AHEAD program, this funding cannot be used for AHP eligible housing projects, but here is a list of examples of what we intend this additional $1 million to be used for. It must specifically be targeted to pandemic relief or recovery initiatives. We did a lot of outreach with key stakeholders within our district to determine what needs they were facing because of this pandemic. And we came up with a list of potential uses that I am going to go through here. Clearly, there's going to be working capital issues with a lot of nonprofits. There's going to be a lot of holes in budgets because of loss of certain fundraising or other sources, funding sources, because of the pandemic. There's going to be increased costs related to janitorial, cleaning, supplies, PPE, other health-related expenses. There might be increased childcare expenses for staff. There may be loss of staff. Loss of volunteers is a huge issue. So the idea essentially with the pandemic versus the pandemic piece of this versus the regular piece is that if you're an organization that in the past has used AHEAD or been interested in AHEAD, we've always said it's project-based and it's economic development. It still is. This year, we're opening it up a little bit more, that if you're an organization who has a hole or a need and you are essentially trying to survive because you've been directly impacted by the pandemic, the AHEAD program could be a good source to try and help fill some of those holes. This is going to be a self-selected process. We'll get to that when we go to the application. The application itself is for the whole program, and as you see when we get there, project sponsors will be able to select if this is a project that is a regular ahead project or if this is going to be a pandemic related. The asterisk on all that is that we understand every organization in some way is absolutely going to be impacted by the pandemic. But some organizations are still going to be able to move forward with the suite of programs and services that they can provide. They just might have to move to a virtual environment. So an organization that maybe provides technical assistance still can potentially provide that technical assistance in a virtual environment. Versus some organization that runs, say, a homeless shelter, you can't provide those services virtual. You need to provide those services on the front line to the homeless. You need to institute the social distancing. You need to increase the cleaning. So you can see it's nuanced, but there is a slight difference between what we're thinking about in terms of this funding. If there's questions about this, I'll be happy to answer them and also provide some guidance on selecting that. The other thing I would say here is that we have committed this $1 million to the pandemic in addition to the 1.5 in the regular ahead program. We also don't know what the market will bear. If we get 300 applications this year and the vast majority are pandemic related, we will absolutely fund more than $1 million if that is what the market is bearing. So this $1 million is a minimum. It might end up being more depending on what the market asks us to do. So here's a program timeline that I did discuss earlier. This is for the 2020 year. So the application round opened earlier this week on May 5th. So those materials are live right now on our website. There's a couple of deadlines to keep in mind as we go along in this month. So all documents need to be submitted through our members. So for our members, if you're going to be working with different organizations and supporting multiple projects, we ask that you submit a workspace request deadline by May 28th so that we have enough time to create that workspace so you could submit those documents. The application deadline is June 2nd, and that is a very hard deadline. We'll talk about this a bit more a little later in the presentation. We will then use the summer, the rest of June and July and August, to review the applications and get approval for them for an award notification in September. And that would be the point that the member and the nonprofit could access the funds. We'll then have a disbursement period between award announcement in September and December of 2020 to get the funds out of the door. And then the nonprofit or the government agency or the tribal association will have 18 months from the award date, which is September, to use the funds. So for the program there this year, the compliance period to be able to use the funds would be from essentially September 2020 to March 2022. So the application itself, which is really the bulk of the presentation. Reminder again that this is where we are in this part of the presentation. The process itself includes an application package. It's a relatively simple application package, and it includes 3 items. The ahead application and budget, which is on our website currently, and we're going to go through a case study or an example of that very shortly and look at that application. The package itself, or the other 2 documents that we require are a copy of the project sponsor's most recent IRS nonprofit status letter. Clearly that's for nonprofits. If it's a government agency, a local government, or a tribal association, we're looking for some type of founding documents, whether that's articles of incorporation. In a tribal association, maybe they have a board of governors that has that established the tribe. Whatever it may be, we need some type of founding documentation for the organization. And then we're looking for a roster of the project sponsor. So we're looking for a roster of their management team and a roster of their board of directors, or once again, a governing entity such as a city council or a tribal governing board, if that is the case, depending on who is applying. We have receive feedback that some nonprofits don't have boards. And if that's the case, please include a statement in the application package just so we know it's not missing. Because if we don't see anything in there, we'll assume that it wasn't included. The key point here is that these three documents essentially comprise the application. And if the application is incomplete, the project will be deemed ineligible. It's important to note we don't provide feedback during the application round. We trust members and project sponsors to be able to put together an application package and submit that. We end up reviewing all the applications after the end of the application round. So it's really important to make sure the package is complete because we're just not providing that feedback during the round. We will provide feedback, technical assistance and feedback before submitting it, but once it is submitted, we're going to assume that that's what is being submitted for eligibility. So the application material is on our website right now. And we wanted to go through a case study of the application just to show how it works along with the budget. But before doing that, just wanted to also point to another document that we have online, and that is the AHEAD Application Reference Guide. This is a technical guide. It doesn't offer tips or tricks or hints like I'm going to offer today on this webinar. So it doesn't actually talk about how to, what should I put in this section, but it describes the how to fill it out. So once again, this is more of a technical guide. We encourage folks to look at that if they have any questions. But really the value in this webinar is being able to go through that application and tell you what we're looking for, which is not available in the reference guide. So with the application itself, let's take a look at the sample 2020 application. So when you open this up, there's going to be a couple of tabs here. The main tab is going to be the application itself, and then there is a link to an application budget. So real quick before we get into the meat of this, just wanted to show how to navigate this. We've got some instructions at the top that have clear deadline for when this is due. There's a progress bar you'll note at top that shows whether the application has been completed. In this case, we're at 95%, so this application is not complete. So we're going to finish this today to show what that looks like. There's also a couple of navigation tools up here. There are some input fields throughout the application. If it's a required field, it will be highlighted in orangish yellow and the exclamation point. If the field has been filled out correctly, you'll get a green check mark. If it's been filled out incorrectly, you'll get a red X. And if no entry is required, it'll be grayed out. But note here, there are some fields that may appear to not be required when you start the application, but depending on what selections are made, may open up. We tried to create it to be top down, so there should be no surprises. You shouldn't have to go back up to fill out a required field. If it opens up a required field, it should be below. That being said, the application can be filled out in any order you want, and it can be saved to your desktop and be worked on. It does not need to be, it's an Excel file, so it does not need to be filled out all in one shot. It can be saved and worked on over time. The last navigation tool here is the application table of contents. We've got links. All these are live links to go to different parts of the application. And what we think is also helpful, it also shows the progress in each of these sections. So we can see here that 4 of these sections are already complete, and we've got a couple of sections that need to be done, which is what we're going to go through here. The last piece I'd show you before we start actually looking at the content here is that regardless of where you are in the application, you can always go all the way back up to the top through a couple of ways. We have some live links saying back to the top that are throughout the document, or you can always go up to either the top left or the top right and click it, and it will always take you to the top of the application. So that's one way to kind of jump back and forth. So we can jump to this project summary section and then jump back up to the top. So let's actually get into the application itself. Most of this is self-explanatory, but I still want to walk through this. The project information is going to be where you put the name and location of the project. Note here that depending on who the project sponsor is, we understand that some projects might be in a different location than where they are located at. That is completely fine. We've had some California nonprofits that are doing expansion work in Nevada. So the project will be in Nevada, but the nonprofit will be in San Francisco. That's completely fine. With the project name, we do have a character limit here of 60, and we do ask that when project sponsors are thinking about a project name, to think about what they would like to be displayed to the public, because we end up using this project name when we make an award. So if it's a very generic project name, like I have here, this doesn't really tell us anything. Whereas if it was a bit more detailed and explained what the project was going to do within that 60 characters, I think it makes for a much more meaningful communication from a marketing perspective. So just take that into account when filling this out. The member institution is self-explanatory. The only comment I have here is that the member contact here should be the member that we will contact if we have any questions or if we want to give an award. And the same thing goes for the sponsor information. The sponsor should also be relatively straightforward. I would list the contact that we should contact if the project does win an award. We do ask the different types of organizations. We have a couple of choices. This is just for data purposes. Do the best you can to answer this question. The sponsor description is describing the sponsor's core mission, their management structure, and accomplishments. This section really should be a clear, concise overview of the organization. This isn't the location to discuss the project, so keep this high level and really talk about the organization. You could talk about the successes you've had. You could talk about some management structure, and really why you're in business, why you do what you do, and the communities that you serve. One tip in filling out this section is, since this is an Excel spreadsheet, each of these fields does act like a cell. So if you hit enter anywhere within there, it'll exit you out of the cell. If you want to add a paragraph anywhere within one of these free-flowing fields, you can hit Alt-Enter. And when I hit Alt-Enter, that will create a paragraph. Just a tip from some feedback that we have received. The Ahead Grant section, we can see that this is a section that is not complete. We can see the status here is at 86%, and the reason is because there's a field that is not been filled out, and that is the actual Ahead grant amount. So we will fill out the request here. They're looking for $45,000 grant, and we could see the behavior change from a required field to a satisfactory answer on that question. We have mentioned previously, and we will mention multiple times more, that Ahead is an 18-month grant period. So if the project wins an award, those will be announced in September. And the latest that the compliance period or that the project can use the funds is going to be March of 2022. So we've hard-coded these beginning and end dates. So we just ask the project sponsor to let us know when they're going to spend the money. And just to be clear here, Ahead can be used for much shorter than an 18-month grant period. In fact, we expect for some of the pandemic-related initiatives that it might be used over a very short period of time to fill operating gaps. So just understand that 18 months is the maximum. You can absolutely suggest a shorter grant period and also close out the grant in less than 18 months. We do have a question about whether the project or the sponsor has received an Ahead grant in previous years. If there are any questions about past awards, please don't hesitate to contact the bank. We'll provide that information. And the reason we ask this is because previous award compliance or non-compliance is taken into account when we're evaluating the applications. Since we have limited funds and a lot of competition, we want to take into account other awardees and maybe new awardees or new projects. But that being said, winning an award in past years, it doesn't exclude the project sponsor or a project from applying again in the current year, especially if that past award was successful and is potentially, let's say, expanding to a new area with a replicable and successful model. So this is really for information for us and could potentially be taken into account if we get down to a tiebreaker situation, or if we do have any entities that maybe struggled with compliance in past years. The project summary section is really the area the main area to describe what the project sponsor is going to do with the AHEAD grant. There's not a lot of characters here. We have 3,000 characters, so we're really looking for clarity so that we can understand the project. And so the keep it simple method is typically the best way to go about with this section. We want sponsors to describe how the project or the program will work, how it will benefit low to moderate income communities, what the goals of the project will look like, and then the outcomes and the impact that they expect to have if they receive a AHEAD grant. And generally speaking, this is also the section to make the case from an economic perspective and what the economic benefit of receiving a AHEAD will be. It's been mentioned previously, but this isn't a targeted economic development grant program. So we really are looking to see how the project will lead to outcomes such as job creation or preservation, improved individual and family self-sufficiency, etc. That being said, we understand that we have this additional funding for pandemic-related projects. So when you think about project summary here for the pandemic specific request, you can also maybe think about it as your program summary, meaning you as a organization, even if this isn't a project-based request, you still are providing a valuable service to the community. So to tell us what you're doing, tell us what you're doing with this money, whether it's offering a service or a program. So it's nuanced, but that's probably the best way to think about this is project summary or program summary for this year. Under project type, this is where project sponsors can self-select whether this is a regular AHEAD grant request or a pandemic-related request. So we have a drop-down list of the different project types, and we ask to pick the category that best fits a project. We understand that some programs and projects, of course, cross many different types of community development. So this isn't always the easiest easiest question to answer, but do your best to kind of fit what the project is. And that helps us on our end, because when we're evaluating these projects, part of the criteria we're looking for is diversity in project types. So we want to make sure that we get to as many different project types as possible. You can see that these are pretty much the same as last year as far as capacity building, entrepreneurial, financial education, housing initiative, job training, social services, and technical assistance. A couple of things I want to point out here. We understand there might be other categories that we have not entered here. We have a section for that. If you select other economic development, this field will open up and you can provide a brief explanation of what type of economic development project, if it doesn't fit within the project types we selected. Conversely, with pandemic relief, that's also an option here, and this is new for 2020. And this section is going to be really important for us to distinguish between a specific pandemic relief request and I call it a regular AHEAD project-based request. So if you are going to be specifically looking for working capital or operating support or a way to bridge fundraising or whatever it might be, and you are submitting a pandemic relief, it will open this additional question here, and this is unique to the pandemic. And it basically is asking to make the case or an explanation of how the sponsor has been directly impacted by COVID-19 and how that AHEAD grant will address relief. So this can be used in conjunction with the program or the project summary to provide further evidence of why this is so necessary, why your services are so valuable, how you've been impacted so negatively by the pandemic, and why you need this money. So this is really the place to make that case. I'm just going to put something in there to satisfy that. So we've now filled out the project type. Depending on what project type is selected, there's one other question that we'll get to that is unique to that. But first, we have some project impact questions. These questions, these ones on the screen, these all have to be answered by all projects. We ask if the project will create or retain jobs, and then if so, estimate the number of jobs to be created or retained. In past years, job creation has been a big focus of AHEAD. We understand this year, job creation could be very challenging. So we understand this year it's going to be much more about retaining jobs. And that's just the reality of the situation we're here. Do your best to estimate this. And I will also say on the pandemic relief projects, we do understand that there might be no jobs being created. There may be one job being retained. That is a completely acceptable answer. we're not judging these based on the sheer volume of number of jobs being created this year. We're looking at the story and trying to make that type of assessment. So the point I'm trying to make is I don't want this to be a negative if you're saying I'm only retaining one job. That job might be extremely important for you and your organization and the community. The next 4 questions ask about eligibility. And this is an important piece because one of these questions has to be answered yes, because we need to determine if the project is actually helping individuals with salaries below a certain area median income. We need to see if the project's helping small businesses, if it's providing services or benefits to the community, or if the jobs created are for folks, for low-income folks. If you can't answer yes to at least one of these questions, you're not going to be eligible for a head. And so hopefully, you don't spend too much time with the resources to fill this out if you can't answer yes to one of these questions. This shouldn't be a problem for most sponsors that are interested, but just want to point that out very clearly that every year we do have a couple of projects that answer no to all these questions, and they are going to be ineligible. And to be clear here as well, we don't ask for backup documentation on this. We just will trust the project sponsor answering yes to this. Going further down, we do have a specific question about impact that is tied to the project type. So depending on which project type is selected, we're going to ask 2 other questions. You can see here that these are all grayed out. They are not required field. But since we did select pandemic relief projects, you can see here are the 2 questions that we do want answered. Unique individuals or small businesses currently served by the sponsor, and then new or unique individuals or small businesses will be served if they get an ahead grant. The basic point of this is a before and after snapshot of where you are as an organization right now, and if you do get an ahead grant, and if you can successfully implement this project, where will you be after that? I want to also make it clear here that we understand some of this is going to be challenging this year, and we're not gauging a project that maybe serves 500 people as a better project than one that serves 5. We are looking at each of these applications individually and trying to make an assessment about the impact of that particular project. So this isn't a game of trying to enter the biggest number. That's not how we're comparing these applications. We're just trying to get a feel for the overall story of this project or this program and the potential impact that it will have. This is also important because if you do win an award, when we get through the compliance period, we will take a look back at the application and just see if you were successful or close to being successful to what you thought you were going to do. So we do have to fill this out because this is a required field. So we'll just enter that and we'll see that we are getting closer to being done with this application. The progress bar moved up. Underneath that, we do ask a question about targeted beneficiaries. We have pre-populated with various groups that you may be benefiting, but we understand as well that you may be serving a group that's not here. If that's the case, we have a catch-all category called other at-risk populations. If that's selected, it will open up this required field and you could fill that out. Targeted service area is a drop-down list. Options are rural, urban, peri-urban, and other. We do get questions on peri-urban. Tends to be a place like, for example, Washoe County, where Reno is located, to where Reno is a relatively dense downtown, but you get outside of Reno and it gets rural very quickly. So if this was a project that was working across Washoe County, you might want to put peri-urban. This is just for our own tracking. Once again, there's no right or wrong answer here. We're just trying to understand what the project is and who it's, what area it's serving. We've had some projects that are more at the state level. That's where you could potentially put other, and then this would open up this field for you to fill out what other service area you're providing. These last 3 questions are just data elements. There is no right or wrong answer, and we don't use this to assess the application. They're just data elements that we need to collect. The project results section is where you will tell us how you will measure or evaluate what you're trying to do in the project. So this could be the section where you talk about the number of of new individuals that you're going to serve. It could be the place where you're going to say how many organizations you're going to give a loan to. Whatever it might be, generally speaking, it tends to be a quantitative measure just because they're a little easier to understand, and it's also easier to look back at this at a later date and see how successful they were. But we understand some programs or projects it might be a little softer. So anyway, this is really the area to talk about how you will measure success. What's going to be a successful project for you, whatever those metrics might be. This is a new section this year that is also a data element questions, where we're asking if the project is using any of the other Federal Home Loan Bank financing. So in the example we have here, we're asking if it's using any of our discounted advance programs, which are the ACE and the CIP program, or if they're using our affordable housing program. And that could be the competitive program that we talked about, or it could be the Wish and IDEA set-aside programs. Both of those fall under the affordable housing, or if they are using the Quality Jobs Fund. If you answer yes to any of these, we'll ask what the award number was, the name, the amount, whatever it might be. If there's any questions about this, please don't hesitate to reach out to the bank. As I said, this is not going to be we're not necessarily assessing this. We just want to make sure we understand which sponsors are using some of our programs, or which members are using some of our programs across different programs. The project use of funds is where we reiterate again that the HED funds must be used within 18 months of the effective date of the award agreement, which we'll talk about a little bit later. The award agreement, the program agreement only is required if you win an award. So we'll talk about that when we get a little later in this presentation. So this is essentially just a certification and a reminder again that the funds must be used within 18 months of the award date. And then we ask specifically how the HED grant will be used during that period and how those operations will be funded in subsequent years. So this is the part where this ties to the budget. So this is where a project sponsor would be able to explain, we are going to use this for staff and consultants to deliver some service, or we're going to use this for curriculum expenses for a program that we're delivering virtually. Whatever it might be, this is where you get to explain to us more the nuts and bolts of how are you actually using the HED grant, and then how will you fund the program in future years. Maybe you won't fund the program. Maybe it's a pilot program. That's also fair to say here. But this, once again, just goes and helps us get an understanding of the bigger picture around this request and the story. Going back to the 18 months, want to keep hammering on this point, just because we've noticed the last couple of years an increase in a lot of projects not spending all of the funds within those 18 months and requesting sometimes project modifications, sometimes project extensions. We really do ask both members and sponsors to be aware and try and, to the best of their ability, respect that 18-month grant period. So we will take that into account if we do see a pattern of sponsors not using funds within that time frame. Next section talks about the members' financial involvement in the project, and we've got two sections here. We've got a financial involvement or a non-financial involvement in the project. This is really going to be based on the relationship between the member and the project sponsor, and it helps us understand how involved the member is with the sponsor. This section is not going to be looked upon as a negative if the member is not providing a grant or loan or some type of non-financial support, such as volunteer time. This is only looked upon as a positive. So if a member is on the board or you provide volunteer time, that helps just paint a good picture. But once again, this is not a negative if this section is left unanswered. And then the last couple pieces of the application are tied to the sources of funding that are either in process or already committed, and then any organizations involved. Once again, there's no right or wrong answer here. This just paints a picture of who else is involved in this project. And that helps us in a couple ways. On smaller projects, if we see that no other organizations are potentially involved and that a HED is a major source of funding, that might be looked upon as a positive because we could see that a HED is really, really needed, and we really want a HED to be used in that situation. Alternatively, we could see a project where there are dozens of other partners, a lot of funding, and maybe a head is not as needed. It's a nice to have. That also could be a situation. That's not an absolute, because it could be the opposite as well. We could see a small project that just doesn't look like it's feasible and doesn't look like they have other funding, and we could see a large project that is really going to be transformational we want to be part of. So that's a bit of a hedge of an answer, and why I keep saying this is really about the storytelling and just helps us paint a picture of the project so we can do an assessment. The last piece is the budget, and then we will get close to a break and be able to start to look at some of the questions. So at the bottom of the form is a link to the application budget. So you can hit the blue button and it brings you to the application. And some of this is going to be already filled out at the top. And if you want to go back to the application, you can always click back to a head application. So that's the way you can toggle between these two. So the top of this is going to be already pre-filled from the application. And a couple of other pieces will be pre-filled. This piece on the ahead and how much is being requested. The rest of the budget, anything in yellow, is going to need to be filled out by the project sponsor. Now, I've already filled this out as a sample just to show the behavior of this budget and what we expect. So this is the sources side. So this is going to be all the different funding sources, whether they're committed or not committed, that you expect to get for this particular project or program. And in this case, we have a bunch of preset sources, but we understand there may be other sources as well. So we've got a couple of customized categories if you have other sources of income that we haven't reflected here. For this project, we can see that they're requesting $45,000, and then they've got $90,000 in other sources that they are seeking. So what we ask is that, let's take example one, this government grants item. We just want to know, of that $25,000 that's estimated on this budget, because this is just an estimate, how much is anticipated and how much is committed? In the example here, we can see that $20,000 is still anticipated, but they do have $5,000 committed. So that way we get a good idea about where the project is in terms of sources. Note that this column over here will equal 0 if this is all filled out correctly. So just to show the behavior, if that's not the case, we said that $25,000 was going to be received from government grants. If I didn't fill out this section, you can see that it's showing $5,000 has not been allocated. So I just need to allocate that last $5,000, and this column will go to 0. So the sources is relatively straightforward. The uses is going to be, how are you going to use the funds? So in this case, we see a $135,000 budget. We need to allocate $135,000 to various uses. We can see here that in this column, we've allocated all 135, so this looks good. And then the two columns we ask is of each of those line items, how much are you going to potentially fund with a head, and how much are going to come from other sources? We don't care on the uses side if those are committed sources or not. We just want to know what your estimate is of what's going to be funded. So let's look at an example here. And I've intentionally made this to have a mistake so that we can see the behavior when there is a mistake. But salaries and wages. So this project's going to have $60,000 in salaries and wages, and they are estimating that $20,000 is going to come from a head, and $30,000 is going to come from other sources. We can see here that there's $10,000 that hasn't been allocated. Let's just keep that there for a moment and assume that think we're done with the rest of this budget. So let's pretend we filled out the rest of this budget. We're ready to go. The one last step that you need to do is go back to the application, and there's a checkbox at the bottom that says the application budget worksheet has been fully completed. And I want to show the behavior here because I think this is helpful. When I click it, you can see that I get an error message. The budget doesn't balance. Please navigate and correct the errors. If we go back to the budget and scroll down, the form itself will highlight where there's a mismatch. And so we can clearly see that there's something wrong with this with this row. And that's because I haven't allocated all $60,000. So if I go back here and fix this, you can see that red error message goes away. If I go back to the application itself, I can see the error message here has gone away. And the most important part, when I go up here to the progress bar, it shows 100%. So this application is now complete. We can save it and move on. So back to the slides, and we're almost ready for a quick break and to look at some questions, but just want to reiterate one last point on the application before we get to the questions. Everything in the AHEAD program and in all Federal Home Loan Bank programs go through our members. So members must submit all documents to the bank, and they must do it through an electronic portal. So at least in the AHEAD program, project sponsors are not allowed to use the portal. Only members are allowed to use a portal. So members must get the bank a secure portal setup request form to the bank by May 28th. We revised the form this year, so hopefully it's a little bit more clear. We're not going to look at it today. If members have any questions, they can reach out to us, but you can submit up to 5 different project workspaces on each form. If you need more than that, just fill out additional forms. So that setup request date is May 28th, and that gives us enough time to be able to set up the workspace. I will note here that the workspace only takes 5 minutes to set up, but it's not an automatic process. So we do our best to respond to members within 24 to 48 hours on letting them know when the workspace has been created, and we will send a confirmation email. The deadline is 5 p.m. on Tuesday, June 2nd. As I said, that is a hard deadline. And a note that is probably not so much a problem for most of the application, but need to point it out, is that all personal identifying information, PII, must be redacted. So here's some examples: Social Security, bank account numbers, personal home addresses. At the application level, we typically don't see many of these, but where we have seen it is on the management rosters and the board rosters. Occasionally we have seen personal home addresses, phone numbers, emails. While technically not PII from an account perspective or Social Security perspective, we really don't want that level of detail being submitted to us. So we would just ask that project sponsors make sure to keep it high level. You know, names and organizations are totally acceptable, but getting into home addresses, phone numbers, and emails is starting to borderline a little too much. So if we notice any of that, we may reject documents if we do see that PII on them. With that, we're going to answer a few questions. I'm going to put the webinar on pause for just a moment while I go through some of the questions. And the caveat here with the questions is that if they are too detailed, we will please follow up with me after this webinar and we can talk about it. I'm going to try and answer questions that are more high level, that are helpful for hopefully everybody attending. So I'm going to go mute for a minute and look at these questions, and I'll be back on in about 1 minute. Thanks for your patience. We've got a lot of great questions. I'm going to do my best to go through as many as I can. I might cut some of them short and try and get to them towards the end. So as I said, if I don't get to your question, please don't take it personal and follow up with me afterwards, and I'll be happy to answer. So there's a question about funding the entire grant amount if it's not requested. Do you offer a lower amount? We do. If we award a project, it usually doesn't mean that they get the full award amount. So as I said earlier, the maximum amount requested is $50,000. Most nonprofits do end up requesting that amount, but the average grant is usually $25,000 to $30,000. So we do offer a lower amount, and then usually expect the budget to be revised slightly at the time of disbursement, just because we were part of the funders that maybe gave less money. There's a questions about the COVID relief, if it having an economic development focus. It's a great question. It does not have to be as economic development focused, because we understand that you maybe aren't an economic development organization. So we understand there will most likely be nonprofits that are applying for pandemic relief that aren't strictly offering economic development type services to their clients. So it does not have to have an economic development focus. There's questions about if a sponsor can apply to both. We have no rules that you can't apply to both, but I will just say that the chances of winning 2 awards is extremely low, just because of the fact of demand. So I would pick what the biggest need is. If an economic development project is the biggest need, go for that. If you're looking for pandemic support to survive, to me, survival is a much bigger need than the other piece. So it's really going to be your call. There was a question about the application itself being geared toward pandemic-related grants. I touched on this in the webinar so far. You'll see that a lot of the application is around the project. If you're going to be doing pandemic relief, you could think about that more as a program. Because as I said, if you are a nonprofit, you are providing some service to the community. So you can talk about what programs you provide and why they are so needed. And I think that still fits within the application itself. There's a question about if the requests exceed the $1 million, is the total cap for the program still 2.5? Yes, the answer is we have 2.5 million for the AHEAD program with $1 million commitment to pandemic relief. If we do get more requests than 1 million for pandemic relief, we might make a decision to fund more than $1 million, but no matter what, we can only fund 2.5 million in both economic development and pandemic related projects. There's a question about partnering with another organization and submitting their IRS information. It depends on the situation. If you're partnering in the sense that you are your own 501c3 and they're their own 501c3, we don't need their information. If they're a fiscal sponsor, then yes. If you don't have a 501c3 and you are fiscal sponsor and they're a fiscal sponsor, we will need the fiscal sponsor information, because they're ultimately the organization that's going to get the money, even if it is going to then be passed through to the nonprofit. There's a question about if a project is in multiple locations. We understand that, and I know the form is not necessarily set up to be able to handle various locations. You can, if that's the case, that's really going to be where you can describe in like the targeted service area, you can describe that area and where you're serving, and then just do your best with an address. You have to have some address in that area, I'm assuming, and maybe it's just going to be the nonprofit's address in that particular area. There's a question about sorry, I'm going to put you on pause one more second while I look through a few more questions. So I'm going to go mute for one more minute, so give me a second. Thank you for your patience. All right, thank you for your patience. A few more questions. So there's a question about using the funds shorter than 18 months. Do we disclose that in the application or once awarded? Uh, you would disclose it in the application, and then you'd have a chance to verify that at the time that you receive the award. There is a section on project or program start date and end date, so that's where you would enter that. There was a couple questions around technical issues with the application. We're not going to get into that here. Please follow up with me afterwards, and we will be able to help you with any technical your issue have is with the spreadsheet. A question about common project types in the past. So in the past, some of the most common project types have been social services, but those don't end up actually being as successful because once again, prior to this year, you got to remember this is really a targeted economic development program, and a lot of social services, while extremely valuable, don't necessarily have an economic development angle. And so it for a lot of nonprofits, they self-select as social service because they're providing a wide range of services, but they're not necessarily being targeted enough or focused enough in the application from an economic perspective. So that has been one of the more popular. As far as funding, job training and then the micro enterprise and small business support are probably the most popular for obvious reasons that that's really where jobs can be created or preserved, or where training for folks to be able to get better jobs can occur. So that's why those tend to be more popular in an economic development grant program. There's a question about, and we talked about earlier, about nonprofit that doesn't have nonprofit status. I'm assuming that you have to have a fiscal sponsor, and so they would be the one that would actually be applying on your behalf. Follow up with me afterwards, and we can talk about that. There are a lot of questions about whether we should use the pandemic piece or whether we should use the regular program. And I know that the answer isn't the most clear, but I would say if you do have a clear project, everyone is impacted by the pandemic. But if you can still operate your program in some form or fashion, I would probably apply for the regular program because if you're an economic development organization, I would probably apply. If you are having a hard time even providing your services, if you have been majorly impacted because you do provide some type of frontline support, whether that's the homeless, whether it's to healthcare workers, whether it's to children, I would probably go from the pandemic relief. And I say that only because the pandemic relief projects, we are going to take a bit of a less economic development lens, whereas the other project types, we are going to still look at it from an economic development angle, even if we completely understand that the impact is going to be very different than what it was in past years, just because of where we are in our economy and with the pandemic. There are some questions, some very specific questions about the budget that I'm not going to get into. Any specific questions about the budget or actually about the application itself that I'd be happy to answer afterwards. There's some questions about use of funds, and I will just say AHEAD will be unrestricted funding, and we are flexible in what you want to use it for as long as it's on the budget. So in this case, if you do feel that salaries at the time of application is the best use, but then you realize later, hey, maybe I'm actually going to use consultants instead, we can be flexible and potentially move it to a different line item. We could do a project modification. What we don't want to see is giving an award and then a sponsor submitting a completely different budget doing something completely different scope of work, because we are very intentional on who and what we're trying to fund here. There's a question about overhead, which is actually a good question. We don't have a strict limit, but I'd just say generally what we see is 15 to 20% for overhead or administrative costs on budgets. If we see anything much higher than that, it just might raise questions. So that would be my kind of feedback, is that 10, 15, 20% range seems to be pretty normal, and we understand that overhead is a potential use of AHEAD. I'm going to there's still a lot of other great questions. I'm going to try and hold off on some of these questions and get to the rest of this webinar. We do have a bit more to go over. This is a shorter piece, but then I want to spend some more time at the end on these questions. So keep sending in some of those questions and we'll do our best to get to them. So quickly, I wanted to just go over a couple other pieces here, only because I want, for members that are new to the program or for project sponsors that are new to the program, I want to set expectations about what the other requirements are if you actually do win an award. So here's back to that timeline. And let's say you do actually win an award. We would announce those in September. And the member and the sponsor would have until the end of the year to be able to request those funds and get the disbursement. So this is kind of a graphic of that process. And we will go over the documentation for this really briefly. And the other point here that we keep reiterating around the use of funds, they are 18 months grants, so they must be fully spent within that time frame. And then of course, all documentation will be submitted via the bank's secure portal. As far as what's actually required at disbursement if you win an award, we do have a head program agreement. So the head program agreement is a contract between the bank, the member, and the project sponsor. We're not going to review it here, but I do encourage all members and all sponsors to go on our website. It is available there for anyone to review, and just make sure you're comfortable with the terms. We try and make the program flexible, but there is some language in there that we just want folks to be comfortable with in terms of recapture, and that's really around fraud and misuse of funds. It's never happened in the program, but it's in the contract, so we just want folks to be comfortable with that. Members will also submit a certification and disbursement request form. This is just from the member, and it's just certifying that all program requirements have been met at that time. And then we'll ask for an updated disbursement budget. And we've touched on this a little bit in this webinar, but that's because right now you're going to be submitting an application in May. And of course, in the next 5 to 6 months, as we know, the world can change very quickly. So we do understand that between the time of application and the time of an award, things could change. In addition to the ahead grant might be less than what you requested. So we do want an updated budget, and we will compare that to what happened since the time of application. And we may ask some questions. If there's a major scope change in the project between the application and disbursement, there is a chance that we could make the disbursement ineligible. That's really the bigger concern here. If there's changes in the budget just because of shifting funding, because of money being, because of less funding being received, we're much more understandable about that, as long as the project sponsor can certify that they still think the scope is the same. We're really much more concerned about major scope creep between the time of application and disbursement. There are some budget workbooks that are on our website. I'm not going to go through them, but once again, I just want interested parties to know that they are there and to understand what the expectation is around documentation if they do win an award. Once the disbursement, a complete disbursement package is received, we do typically can fund to the member within 15 to 30 days, and then the member is required in the program agreement to disperse to the nonprofit or a project sponsor within 30 days of receipt. As I said earlier, everything that the Federal Home Loan Bank does goes through our members. So it will be passed through from them to the project sponsor. The last piece is compliance. And again, here's this timeline. This would be after the award and after the money's been dispersed and the project sponsor has started using the funds for whatever time frame they have identified. You can see here, March 2022 is the ultimate compliance deadline, but as mentioned earlier, a project sponsor can use the funds in a shorter time frame and close out the grant to finish the compliance documentation if they choose to do so. So the compliance process consists of 3 documents: an ahead project status report, ahead compliance budget, and backup expense documentation. As with everything, submission will go through the Bank Secure portal and through members. And we do want to make this point that non-compliance for past awardees, it can impact the chance of being an award ahead grant this year. We've got some questions about what non-compliance means. So when we talk about non-compliance, we're talking about not using all the ahead grant within the 18 months, not submitting a complete compliance package within 18 months, any major changes to the scope of the project or the budget during that time period without notifying the bank, and then not curing any deficiencies within a reasonable time frame for fixing the compliance. So those are all kind of examples. We do take compliance seriously, and we want members and sponsors to know that it can get taken into account when we are reviewing current year applications. The project status report itself is a final report, and it is also on our website right now. It's a 2.5-page document. It's from a reporting perspective compared to other grants, we do think that is relatively light, but we do think it's an important piece because it helps us understand the final status of the project. It's got questions around what was accomplished, what impacts and outcomes were achieved versus what was originally planned, if other funding sources were either committed or not committed, and then a description of what the final ahead grant was actually used for, including the backup documentation. Members and sponsors will certify that it's all correct. A couple other details: must be signed by authorized signer. We're not going to look at that status report, but as I said, it's on our website. We encourage all interested parties to review it just so you know what you're getting into. And then the second piece is a compliance budget, which looks very much like the disbursement budget. And so what this does is actually a comparison between what the project sponsor said was going to happen at the time of disbursement and then what's going to happen at the time of compliance. Once again, we understand that things shift and move and change, and some compliance budgets look exactly like the disbursement budgets, and others have to change just because of different funding sources or projects having to pivot and move different ways. So we're just trying to get an understanding for what actually happened with the project in terms of the budget, and were all the funding sources actually committed? Did you have to find other funding sources? Did you lose some funding sources? Whatever the story might be, we just want to know it. And the last piece is backup documentation. Tends to be the most complicated and have the most questions for in terms of compliance. So we did want to spend just a little bit of time before we wrap up this webinar and go back to trying to answer some questions. So backup documentation is going to be required for each line item that is funded by a head. We don't need it for every line item on the budget. So a quick example, let's say it's a $100,000 budget that received a $40,000 ahead grant. We do not need backup documentation for all 100,000, but we need it for the 40,000 on those various line items that were either partially or fully funded with a head. So the reason we say this is because we want project sponsors to be selective in what they want to use for a head, depending on their own situation and their own accounting systems. If they have a budget that has 20 different line items and they're going to allocate a head to it, we just want project sponsors to know that we're going to require 20 different sets of backup documentation for each of those line items. Whereas if they want to use all the ahead just on the salaries, we're only going to need documentation for the salaries. This is really more just a word of advice, since ahead is unrestricted funding and is somewhat flexible as long as it's approved on a budget. We can move around the funding on different parts of the budget. We just want to make sure that project sponsors know what they're getting into when they think about how to allocate ahead. So here's some of the more common more common expenses that we see ahead being used for, and then some of the backup documentation that we typically expect to see. So salaries, wages, and benefits, taxes, that's the most popular use of ahead. And so what we want to typically see is W-2s or copies of pay stubs. Depending on the nonprofit or the organization, if they have good fund accounting, a detailed payroll report works really great. In fact, that can work. That's actually usually the best. If you can have a detailed transaction report based on fund accounting, that's a really great backup documentation. We see a lot of consultants, so we would want to see paid invoices and then copies of checks. Once again, you have a detailed report that you can provide for any of these. That will suffice, but I'm just giving hard examples of what we typically see. Program expenses such as travel, supplies, instruction. We want to see receipts or some type of detailed transaction report. Indirect or overhead expenses, someone asked a question earlier about that. We can expect to see a couple of things. If it's a nonprofit that has a federal allocation report, we would want to see that. Otherwise, we can accept a written explanation or a statement from them saying, we typically allocate 13% to overhead, and we'll just add that to the file. So hopefully that makes it a little bit easier, but we do need some documentation around the overhead. And then other expenses that maybe aren't so obvious, you can please follow up with the bank and we can have that discussion about what will work. I will say that we do provide lots of technical assistance to both members and project sponsors after they won an award. Whether it's at disbursement or at compliance, we are providing a lot of technical assistance and trying to figure out, what can be provided in the most efficient manner. So I want to get back to some of the questions because I know we still had a lot of questions that folks were asking. I'm going to put this on pause for another minute while I look through some more of these questions. And I'll also put my contact information up. In fact, I'll probably put that up now so that you have it and can see it, although it is in the slide deck that you do have access to. I'm going to put you on pause, and I will be back in 1 minute to answer these questions. Thank you for your patience. A couple more questions that we want to get to. There is a question about there's a question about a CDFI and whether they can be both a project sponsor and an applicant. And unfortunately, the answer is no. If you are a member, a CDFI member of the bank, you can only be one or the other in terms of benefiting from the program. So you could be the project sponsor, but you would need to find another member to support you, or you can be the member supporting another nonprofit organization. There's a question if this is going to be taped. We are recording this webinar, and if the quality is good, we will try and get it posted somewhere, probably YouTube. So look for that. There's a question about if it's absolutely mandatory for a project sponsor to partner with an FHLBank member. That answer is a hard yes. That is how the bank works. We do not provide funding directly to nonprofits. We exist for the benefit of our members. We are a cooperative. So even though the money is ultimately getting to nonprofits, we are relying on the relationships of our members with their own partners and in their own local community. There was a question about setting up workspaces and carrying those over. This is really more for members. This is a good question. All members must request new workspaces. There are no carrying over of any past workspaces from past years. So all members need to submit requests for all new workspaces for the application round. There's a lot of questions. I want to respect people's time and also want to respect the time they've taken asking these questions. There's a lot of very specific questions about we're this type of organization, we provide this type of service, would this work for COVID or not work? Please follow up with me. I think some of these are a little too detailed for this webinar, but I want to be respectful and still answer your question. So you have my email, and send an email to either myself or to a head email, and we'll do our best to answer some of those very specific questions. There actually is a good question that someone asked about Federal Home Loan Bank not being a government organization and whether we would count as match funding if it's partially funded. From my understanding, since we are a private organization, we actually do count if they're looking for a private match, then yes, the Federal Home Loan Bank would count as private fundraising source. If you're looking for some type of federal match, we are not a federal agency, so it would not count. I'm not 100% sure from the question, but I think that's what this person was asking. There's a question about just bank members accessing the portal. I just want to reiterate, yes, for the HEAD program, only bank members can submit and request access to the portal. I'm looking through a lot of questions. Like I said, there's a lot of very specific questions about their program, about program specific, and I'm just not going to take the time during this. So if there's, I'm going to give one last chance. Any other general questions that we can answer? Oh, sorry. Here actually is a good question. This is really for past awardees. This is from an awardee who won a grant in 2019, and they're asking if they are still eligible and if they need to submit their compliance. So for 2019 ahead grantees, your compliance documents aren't due until March 2021, and we understand because of that time frame that that will not be taken into account as far as non-compliance. Your 2019 award will not be taken into account because we're only 6 months into that. Where it will be taken into account is not so much the compliance perspective, it'll be taken into account in a tiebreaker situation. If we end up in the 2020 round where we come with a couple of very similar projects and we see that one of those projects just won an award in 2019, we will take that into account because we do try and provide as much funding to as many different organizations across the district, across different members, geography, sponsors. So so there is no rule that you could reapply again this year, but I also just want to let you know we're not holding the 2019 compliance against any member or sponsor because we're still in the middle of the compliance period. Now the 2018 awards is a different story. If you won an award in 2018 and we're still working on compliance, we could take that into account if there's any non-compliance, but generally speaking, we've already been in contact with folks if there's an issue that we've identified. So I think I'm going to wrap this up. I will make a pitch for the second webinar on May 19th. I want to thank everybody for attending, and I will resend the presentation to everybody that attended. I sent it earlier today at about 12:30, but it looks like we've had some other attendees that have joined since then. So I want to make sure I get everybody. So I will send this out after this webinar ends. If this quality is good, we'll try and post a recording, and please send those emails with specific questions and we'll do our best to answer and help folks with that. Thank you for listening. Appreciate your time. Thank you for everything you're doing, especially in this current environment. And we look forward to some really strong and innovative economic development grants and some pandemic relief that will hopefully help some nonprofits keep in business and keep providing really vital services for our community. So thank you for your time.